Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Equitable Services under Title I. Thank you all so much for joining. This is Michelle Doyle. Before we begin the substance of today's webinar, let me go over a few housekeeping items, which you will also see in your chat box to the right of your screen. Let me ask that everyone please mute your built-in microphone on your computer or whatever device you're viewing this webinar from to reduce any feedback noise during the webinar. Thank you so much for that. If there are technical difficulties during the webinar, I do apologize that it's hard for me to address those as the presenter, but what I would say is to check that your computer speakers are not muted and that you can access the webinar through your system's firewall. So I've written that there. Hopefully, if anyone is having audio issues, they will see that and be able to check their computers. This chat box over to the right will be used to ask any questions. I'm going to do my best to keep up with the questions during the course of the presentation, and will answer any of those questions that I don't get to at the end of the presentation. And then finally, a recording of today's webinar will be posted at www.capspdnow.com. So if you would like to review it or share it with a colleague, please feel free to do so. So let's get going. Equitable Services under the Title I program. This training is sponsored by the California Department of Education, and I'm pleased to be able to present it on their behalf. This is actually the first in a webinar series, and I want to give you an introduction to the webinar series. A series of 3 webinars will be presented on 3 different topic areas. Today's webinar is Title I. In October, I will present on Titles 2 and 3. And in November on Title 4A. And these titles all refer to the Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA. In each webinar, we'll cover the program purpose, the allowable use of funds, the fiscal requirements, and the consultation process. As I mentioned as we began, my name is Michelle Doyle. I'm the CEO of Michelle Doyle Educational Consulting, which was established in 2001. I've also been the Associate Director for Education at the Office of Government Liaison for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, the Director of the Office of Non-Public Education at the U.S. Department of Education, where I worked for 3 different Secretaries of Education. And then I've been the Assistant Superintendent of Schools in the Diocese of Arlington, Virginia, and a Principal and Director of Student Activities and a teacher. And so I hope that that experience that I bring to you today really helps as I work to explain to you equitable services under Title I. Now, I've written a couple of goals for today's webinar. What I hope to do is to provide all of you as participants with a basic understanding of the Title I-A program for private school students, and to provide you with an understanding of the consultation process between public and private school officials, which, as you know, is what is going to actualize this Title I-A program for eligible students attending private schools. Now, all webinars in this series are being recorded. They will be posted, as I mentioned, at www.capspdnow.com. Additionally, 2 tools will be provided to all of you who registered following this webinar. I will provide for you a sample timeline for consultation between public and private school officials and a sample consultation checklist, and these will be based on materials from the U.S. Department of Education, and I'll be sharing those with you. The resources that I've used today are, first of all, the ESSA statute, specifically Section 1117, and that is also in United States Code 20 USC 6320 on the participation of children enrolled in private schools. In addition to the actual statutory language, the U.S. Department of Education issues non-regulatory guidance, and there are two pieces of guidance that are pertinent to the material today. The most recent was issued on March 11th, 2019. It was entitled Updated Title I Equitable Services Guidance. And currently, that guidance is only in draft form, but I will refer to that guidance nevertheless. Secondly, on November 21st, 2016, the U.S. Department of Education issued non-regulatory guidance entitled ESSA Fiscal Changes in Equitable Service Guidance, and we'll be relying on that as well. Both of those guidance documents, should you be interested, are available from the U.S. Department of Education. So let's get into our topic today, Title 1A, Improving the Academic Achievement of the Disadvantaged. Before we get into the actual equitable service pieces of Title 1A, I always like to start with reminding everyone of the program purpose, because sometimes we can get so involved in the nitty-gritty of how every little piece of Title 1A is accomplished that it's easy to lose sight of, I think, a fairly lofty program purpose that Congress has written into this act. And in fact, something similar to this has been in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act since 1965. So the program purpose for Title 1A is to provide all children a significant opportunity to receive a fair, equitable, and high-quality education, and to close educational achievement gaps. The purpose section of Title 1A in ESSA goes on to say that Title 1A accomplishes its purpose by providing effective, supplemental, high-quality instruction for eligible students, professional development for their teachers, and parent and family engagement activities for families of eligible children. And we will talk about all of these different aspects as we proceed through the webinar today. So let's start with the basics of Title 1A, particularly in regard to equitable services. One of the things whenever we're talking about the participation of private school students is we use the term equitable services, equitable participation. I know I say it time and time again. It's talked about in consultation. But exactly what is equitable participation? What is meant by that phrase in the law? Well, according to guidance from the U.S. Department of Education that was issued in March 2009, but is still relevant today, in regard to the participation of private school students, the following items added together generally equal equitable participation in a federal education program. Number one, the program spends an equal amount of funds to serve similar public and private school students, their teachers, and other educational personnel, taking into account their number and education needs. So a relative equal amount of funds. Number two, the program provides services and benefits that are equitable in comparison to the services and benefits provided to public school students, teachers, and other educational personnel. So not just looking at that relative amount of funding, but also what the services look like in a kind of size and scope of services. Number three, the program addresses and assesses the specific needs and educational progress of public and private school students, teachers, and educational personnel on a comparable basis. So we're looking at the needs of both groups of students in kind of the same manner, and we're making decisions about the services that should be provided in a fair and equitable way. Number four, the program provides in the aggregate approximately the same amount of services to public school students, teachers, and educational personnel as it provides to private school students, teachers, and educational personnel, with similar needs. So notice that throughout, even as we talk about educational or equitable participation, I apologize, we're still looking at the needs of the students being served, whether they be public school students or private school students. The needs of those students are a true foundation for everything we do in federal education programs under ESSA. Number 5, the program provides both groups equal opportunities to participate in program activities. So they need to fit the schedule of the groups so that there really is this equal opportunity to participate. Number 6, the program provides private school students, their teachers, and other personnel with an opportunity to participate that provides reasonable promise of participating private school students meeting challenging academic standards. So we don't want to water things down. We don't want to stretch it out too far. We want to make this a substantive, valuable program that has a promise that the students participating are going to meet challenging academic standards. And finally, number 7, the program provides different benefits and services to private school students, their teachers, and other educational personnel from those provided to public school participants if their needs are different. And so think of these 7 aspects of equitable participation as we continue today to look in depth at the Title I program, but let's try to look at it through the lens of what the U.S. Department of Education has defined as equitable participation. It's also very important to remember that the law requires that any services to private school students must be secular, neutral, and non-ideological. That is the phrasing that's used in the law itself. Well, what do those words mean? Well, it has to be a secular program, meaning the activities have no religious or spiritual basis. It needs to be neutral, impartial, unbiased, unprejudiced, and equitable. And it needs to be non-ideological. It can't be related to or based on specific ideas. And while I'm presenting this as part of the Title I program presentation, this is true of all federal education programs in which private school students can participate. Now, let's say a word in general as an overview about funding and services for the Title I-A program. And we're going to get much more in depth into this as the presentation continues, but this is sort of the lay of the land for Title I-A. The low-income student count generates a proportional share of funds for services to eligible private school students. To be part of the low-income student count, the student has to reside in a Title I attendance area. Now that's one group. That's the group that is going to generate the proportional share of funds. Secondly, though, students who are failing or at risk of failing academically are the ones who are eligible for services. An at-risk student, though, must also reside in a Title I attendance area to be eligible for Title I services. So when we look at the Title I-A program, we look at 2 different groups of students. We look at the low-income students who generate a proportional share of funds when they reside in a Title I attendance area. And we look at students who are failing or at risk of failing academically and reside in a Title I attendance area as eligible for services. Could it be that students who are failing academically are low income? Yes, indeed. Could it be that low income students are not all failing academically? Also true. So while there is overlap between the groups, we really are looking at 2 distinct pieces of the Title I-A program. So with the basics out of the way, let's first of all talk about funding and the proportional share of funds. First of all, and near the end of the presentation, I'll talk more in depth about timely and meaningful consultation. But the determinations about the Title I-A program are made during timely and meaningful consultation. And Section 117 of ESSA contains a list of required topics. So consultation is focused on both the funding aspect, those low-income children who are generating dollars, and the services that go to the educationally needy children or the children who are failing or most at risk of failing. In both of these aspects, the LEA has the final decision on the answer, the result for any of the consultation topics. But when we look at the law itself, the list of topics isn't necessarily broken out between topics about funding and topics about services. But I thought it would be clearer today if we started with looking at, in this section of the webinar, the topics that are required to be discussed in consultation between public and private school officials simply on the aspect of funding. And then equally important, we'll talk about the consultation topics that are in regard to services. So first of all, the consultation topics for funding. The size and scope of the equitable services to be provided to the eligible private school students, teachers, and other educational personnel, the proportion of funds allocated for those services, and how the proportional amount of funds is determined. Secondly, whether to provide equitable services to eligible students by creating a pool or pools of funds from the proportional share. The method or sources of data that are used to determine the number of children from low-income families in participating Title I attendance areas. And finally, whether to consolidate and use the funds provided in coordination with funds from other programs like Title I-C migrant education, 2A professional development, Title III English learners, Title IV-A and Title IV-B from 21st century schools. But keep in mind the district, the LEA, is going to make the final decision on all of these consultation topics. But as we talk about funding in specific for Title I, these are the topics that as public and private school officials, you're going to be discussing in consultation. So I've talked about the proportional share for the private school program, and this is garnered from the low-income private school students who reside in Title I attendance areas. They are going to be, the count of those students will generate this proportional share. And I thought it would be clear if I gave you an example of this. So let's say in this hypothetical example, that the total public school low-income count of children residing in Title I-A attendance areas is 1,350 students. And the total private school low-income count residing in Title I attendance areas is 150, which gives us a total of 1,500 public and private school low-income students who reside in Title I attendance areas. What we do is take a proportional share, so we can see that by taking 1,500 total students and dividing it by the 150 private school students, 10% of all the low-income students attending private school and residing in Title I attendance areas are going to generate a proportional share of funds. So in this instance, 10% of the Title I funds are going to be used to serve eligible private school students. So this proportional share of funds is determined based on the total amount of funds received by the LEA prior to any allowable expenditures or transfers by the LEA. So it's right from the get-go that proportional share is determined. The proportional share calculation, as you saw in the previous example, is based on the number of students from low-income families who attend private schools and reside in Title I attendance areas. So now we have this proportional share of funds. What else happens with this proportional share of funds before we can move on to designing a program of services? Well, the law allows for reasonable and necessary administrative costs. So this is the cost that the LEA has to administer the private school program. Indirect costs, which are overall costs. We'd need a whole webinar to really go through indirect costs, but they are general costs, like for human resource personnel, technology personnel, that gets distributed among multiple programs. 1% needs to be taken off the top required by law from this private school portion for parental involvement activities if the private school students are living in a district that receives more than $500 in a Title I-A allocation. So these are costs that come from this proportional share. And then the remaining funds are for Title I allowable activities, which can include professional development. So we'll talk about all the different activities in a moment. But we do have a question, and that is to clarify Title I attendance areas. So when the public school district is looking at its Title I program, it has certain requirements to rank its public school attendance areas in rank order of poverty. And there are some nuances within the rules, but I think for today's discussion, it would be clear enough to say that those Title I, those public school attendance areas are ranked in order of poverty, and the public school district serves those areas in order of poverty until they kind of run out of money. Once they get below a threshold, the district, the public school district, the LEA, can skip certain grade spans, like decide not to serve a middle school or a high school. But in the end, the public school district, the LEA, has followed all of the rules in the law for rank ordering by poverty and determining which of their public school attendance areas are going to be designated as Title I schools. When we look at the private school piece of this, it is the private school students who live in a public school attendance area that is receiving the Title I program. So if the private school child would leave the private school today and move to their designated public school based on their address, does that public school have a Title I program? If the answer is yes, then that private school child is residing in a Title I attendance area. If the answer is no, even if the child is low income, if their address for a public school attendance area is not a Title I school, then that private school child would not generate Title I dollars, just as that public school child does not, because it didn't meet the rank ordering of poverty of public school attendance areas required by law. So I hope that clarifies without getting too much into the weeds. Now, the method for counting students is done through timely and meaningful consultation between public and private school officials. Now, that will help determine the method for obtaining the most accurate poverty count for a specific school. The district, the LEA, does not predetermine the method by which it will collect poverty data, but instead engages in timely and meaningful consultation about how we, public and private school officials together, are going to reach a decision on how we're going to find out the number of low-income children we have in private schools who live in Title I attendance areas. Also during that time, the LEA and the private school officials are going to discuss whether to provide these equitable services by creating a pool or pools of funds, or whether it's going to be on a school-by-school basis. So are we going to take all of the funds generated by private school students and create this one big pool from which we serve eligible children? Or is each individual private school going to have its own amount of dollars, proportional share, that will be used to serve its eligible students? So the final decision as to which method is used to count low-income students attending private schools is definitely the public school districts, but it is following timely and meaningful consultation. And in answer to Rebecca's question, there will be a copy of the PowerPoint provided as well, yes. Now, in counting those, in coming to this decision between public and private school officials during consultation, the LEA has several options in the law for counting low-income students. First of all, they can use the same measure of low income as is used for counting public school students. So generally, that's free and reduced price lunch, or its equivalent through the community eligibility program, which is part of the National School Lunch Program. So if the private school, for example, is part of the school lunch program and they collect school lunch forms or they participate in the CEP program, that school would be able to use the same measure of low income. Most private schools do not participate in the school lunch program, and so that's why these other measures were put into the law so that we could still get a count of low-income students attending private school and residing in Title I attendance areas. So the second method given in the law is to use the results of a survey, which could be extrapolated. The survey needs to protect the identity of the students, so it collects only the address and the grade level of the students. And then it asks the parents to check a box to indicate whether they'd qualify for free and reduced price lunch. Of course, if the public school district is using a different low-income criteria, they would be checking a box that matched that low-income criteria. So we're always going to keep the same criteria between public and private. And so with the results of the survey, it basically says, if you had the ability to participate in the lunch program, would you qualify for it? So it's taking a survey to get at that same data. Thirdly, the law allows that the public school district could apply the low-income percentage of each participating public school attendance area to the number of private school students who reside in that attendance area, and that's often referred to as proportionality. So without collecting actual forms, they would just look at the proportion of private school students who reside in a public school attendance area and apply the same low-income percentage. The law also allows using an equated measure. For example, if the temporary aid to needy families, TANF numbers, are known for both public and private school students residing in a Title I attendance area, and the public school district is using free and reduced price lunch as their measure for Title I low income, then you just set up a ratio where you have the TANF number for private school children on the top of the ratio and the TANF number for public school students on the bottom equals X on the top of the ratio and the free and reduced price lunch numbers on the bottom of the ratio. So I think you can sort of see that math problem there. And there are some states where that TANF information is available, but not too many. You could use comparable data, such as E-rate or tuition assistance data that the private school may already have, and you can simply run it as a spreadsheet using the same income requirements that the Title I-A program is using. But keep in mind that following timely and meaningful consultation where these methods are discussed and the relative benefit or disadvantage of each of them is discussed, in the end, the choice of methods is the public school district. So we do have a question of, is it possible to pool funds across multiple school districts for a diocese that has a large geographic area? And it is not possible to do that. So when we talk about pooling and setting up pool or pools of funds for the Title I-A program, we're talking about within a single district boundary. So the pool could be for all the diocesan schools located or who have students attending schools in that district. And there would be a different pool for a different LEA that had additional Catholic schools in your diocese. So it cannot be across districts. It can only be within a single LEA that the pooling option is available. But this actually is perfect timing because it brings up this other issue that definitely comes up in the Title I program. So which LEA is responsible both for this low income count of students and for eligible students to receive Title I attendance areas? And the LEA responsible depends on the address of the student. So as I think a lot of you listening are aware, a student could reside in one public school district and attend a private school in a different public school district. But it's the obligation of the LEA where the child resides to consult with the appropriate private school officials on all required topics. And that can be a little bit tricky because for an LEA, it's not necessarily just the schools located in your district. It's those that have students that crisscross the district lines and attend a private school in a different district. So we've talked about funding, but as I said, as we started talking about that, equally important in the consultation process is determining services. So now we have worked together as public and private school officials. We have figured out how we're going to count the students. We've done the count of students. We've determined the proportional share of funds. We've taken out administrative cost, indirect cost. We've set aside 1% for parental involvement. Now what do? Well, now we're going to determine the services for our students. The consultation topics that relate to designing effective programs are the following. And if you recall, right in the very beginning of the webinar, I said, and those of you that have heard me speak before know that I say this a lot, really the foundation of all of these programs that we're talking about, and really for the Title I program, it's so important, is always the needs of the students. So the number one consultation topic about designing effective programs is, how are we going to identify the needs of these students? What are their needs? How will we identify them? And then once we do that, what services will be offered? How, where, and by whom will these services be provided? And an important topic is the fourth bullet here, and it is a topic I think we often forget to include, so I like to give it a little extra oomph or a little more emphasis, and that is to talk from the very beginning in consultation is, how will the services be assessed? And how will the results of the assessment be used to improve those services? Because we really want Title I to get better and better each year, and not just to kind of hang around and do a mediocre job. And knowing where we want to go with the program and how we're going to measure those results is a really important part of the consultation process. How and when the LEA will make decisions about the delivery of services. So that's the first part of that bullet. And so it is important as you leave the consultation meeting to know when you're getting together again, to know how long it will take for decisions to be made, so that everybody is part of effective planning for these services. This bullet goes on to say, or the law goes on to say, as regarding consultation, this includes a thorough consideration and analysis of the views of the private school officials on the provision of services through a contract with potential third-party providers. So that's also a part of the consultation process. Consultation topics under the law continue. How, if the LEA disagrees with the views of the private school officials on the provision of services through a contract, the LEA will provide in writing to such private school officials an analysis of the reasons why the LEA has chosen not to use a contractor. Whether the LEA shall provide services directly or through a separate government entity, consortium, or through a third-party contractor. So in a way, it a little bit repeats. It was something that was added, and they put third party in both of those bullets. It's one of those little glitches you see in the law sometimes of, well, we could have phrased that a little more streamlined, but in any case, third party is in both of those. But that tries to get at, and it's not really an issue in California, but some states have these intermediate units or education associations that are quasi-government entities or overarching government, regional government entities. And so it's made clear that the district can contract with them as well. So that's all that piece is in there. So I don't mean for it to be confusing. When including the approximate time of day services will be provided is another piece within Title I itself. And then finally, the LEA has the final decision on all consultation topics. So in regard to eligible private school students, these are students attending private schools, failing or at risk of failing, and residing in Title I attendance areas. Those are going to be the students who are eligible for services. But now in consultation, we need to define what is educational need. What criteria are we going to use to measure that? So at the end of the day, the students that are eligible for Title I services are really the most educationally needy who can best benefit from our Title I program. So the criteria for determining educational need for private school students may or may not be the same as for public school students. And additionally, the criteria is probably going to be different for different grade levels of students. And I'll illustrate this in a moment. Before looking at what some of the criteria or some of the elements might be for educational need, let's look at some of the criteria. So first of all, the law says that there has to be multiple criteria. So examples of that can be test scores, report card grades, a portfolio of work, in-class assessment, teacher rankings, parent input. That's not an exhaustive list. It's just to give you a sense that it cannot just be one criteria. That in consultation, we have to talk about having at least two criteria that are going to work together and in concert with each other to really define this educational need for students that would be eligible for Title I-A services. They have to be educationally related. So for example, poverty itself is not an indication of educational need. Family status is not an indication of educational need. Where you live is not. They have to be educationally related. They need to be objective. So teacher rankings can be very important, in fact, extremely valuable, but they need to be objective. What you don't want to do is to simply ask teachers, who do you think needs to be in the Title I program? Well, every teacher is going to come at the answer to that question in a very different way. So you really want to have some kind of rubric that is established that you agree to in consultation so that all of the students across the grades, across the grade levels, are all being evaluated by teachers or through parent input in an objective way and not just asking an open-ended question and having people put names on a sheet of paper. And then, of course, the criteria have to be age appropriate. So we're going to probably have different criteria for our younger grades. For example, in the younger grades, we're going to rely much less and maybe not at all on standardized test scores. Whereas when we get to the upper elementary grades, the middle grades, we'll probably look at those. So those criteria need to be age appropriate as well. So once we've employed all of these criteria, we then are going to look at the most educationally needy. So we need to look at how the multiple criteria relate to each other so that we know who's most deserving, who's most eligible, so to speak, for these Title I services. And then they're going to be served in the amount of the proportional share that was determined by the low-income private school count. So that's how those two pieces of the puzzle mesh together here. Now, instructional services for students can include direct instruction, counseling, mentoring, one-on-one tutoring. These are all specifically mentioned in the law itself. And the law goes on to say that these services can be provided individually or in combination. So a student could just receive counseling, or a student could receive math and counseling. So that's what that means, individually or in combination. The decision as to which services are provided is subject to timely and meaningful consultation. So this is part of the meaningfulness of consultation. This is the kind of roll up your sleeves and get into a good discussion of these are the needs of the students. This is how we determined them. So that's what those determinations are telling us about what the services should look like. This is the amount of money we have to serve those students. So what program design, what kinds of services are best going to meet their needs with the funding that we have available to serve those students? The services can be provided as a pull-out program during the school day, but that's not the only option. We can provide Title I-A services before school, after school, on weekends, in the summer, or a combination of those. We could do a pull-out program and offer a summer school. We could do after school for older students and a pull-out program during the school day. So again, we're going to look at the needs of our students and see what is going to best meet their needs. Keep in mind, and this refers back to portions of that equitable participation definition that I gave you at the very onset, that services should be of sufficient size and scope to be educationally effective. So what we don't want to do is say, we've got all of these kids eligible for Title I services. Let's give them all a little bit. Is that really going to be effective? And those are the kinds of decisions that you really talk about in the consultation process in regard to Title 1A and program design. How do we design a program that's really going to meet the needs of the Title 1A students? When I was at the U.S. Department of Education, I had a wonderful colleague in the Title I office, and she always used to say, don't make Title I a life sentence. Like, we should be focusing as we design these programs on appropriately providing these support services so that the students in the end don't need the support any longer. And I think that's a great vision for program design and the options of how we offer services, what we offer for services. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning, as we talked about the funding, the proportional share of fund, it's not just student instruction, but there are other allowable uses of Title I funds. And one of those is professional development services. So if you were to offer professional development, it would be from that proportional share of funds. It's not like there's a set aside for it or a specific fund. It's just that as you're making decisions about the best ways to meet the needs of your eligible Title 1A students, professional development is one of the options for services that you can consider. Professional development is can be offered, doesn't have to be, to private school teachers and other educational personnel who teach or serve eligible Title 1A students. So it's not every teacher in the private school, it's those who teach or serve eligible Title I students. Title 1A PD is also not general PD. Its content must be focused on the particular needs of the Title I students. Professional development, just like every other aspect of our Title 1A program design, is part of timely and meaningful consultation, and we're always keeping in mind the needs of the students. So I was asked to repeat the portion related to a review of the budget. So I'm trying to tie the two pieces together. So let's try to think sort of globally, shall I say, on the whole Title 1A program. So what we've done is we've taken the low-income private school students who reside in Title I attendance areas, and they've then generated this proportional share of funds. And this proportional share of funds is going to be used to serve the educationally needy students attending private school who reside in Title I attendance areas. But we can't make decisions about what those services are unless we know the amount of money there is to spend on them. So the example I often give is you're operating a school and you think, I would really like to get new math books for my upper grades. You can't do that unless you know what kind of budget you have, unless you know how much money you have to spend, right? In your own household, love to go out to the movies. Do you have that money before the next paycheck? It's the same everywhere. When we determine how we're going to spend our money, we need to know how much money we have to spend. So that to me is the connection between those two things, is that to make reasonable requests of the district, you need to know your limitations. We don't have unending money in the Title I program. And so when we're working with the district, it's great to ask for the moon, but if the moon is not within our budget, then that conversation is rather futile and it's frustrating for everybody involved. So when you know how much money you have to spend, then you start strategically spending that money to the best advantage of your Title I students. Well, I hope that answers your question. So in addition to instructional services and professional development, 1% of the proportional share needs to be set aside for parent and family engagement activities if the LEA receives more than $500,000 in Title I funds in total. Not the private school program, but just the LEA as a total. So I think that's most of your districts, if not all of your districts in California. So most of you will be looking at a 1% portion of your proportional share being used for parent and family engagement activities. And so again, as part of timely and meaningful consultation, we're going to look at the needs of the students and then talk about what activities would be best suited to their needs to help our parents be a real part of helping our Title I-A students achieve. Parent and family members take part in these activities, but they should also be engaged in determining the types of activities that would best help them support their children's education. So one of the things the law says is that it shouldn't necessarily just be determined from on high, but what do the parents think would be helpful for them? What do they need to help support their children? It could be things like family literacy for the parents. It could be information on access to community resources. So many communities have great resources, and a lot of parents don't know they exist. So those are the kinds of input that parents can provide that can help shape parent and family engagement activities. So that's going to be a 1% set aside. So I know I've talked about consultation. So I tried to divide those topics of consultation into those that had to do with funding and those that had to do with services and program design. But there's a few other pieces of consultation that I wanted to provide to you. So the topics, the specific topics that had to do with funding and designing effective programs, I've already listed above in the previous slides. But if we look at section 1117 of ESSA, there are a few more items that relate to consultation that I think are important as well. First of all, if the LEA disagrees with the views of the private school officials with respect to a consultation issue, the LEA shall provide in writing to such private school officials the reasons why the LEA disagrees. Now, in a way, that sounds a little bit familiar, because if you'll recall, in the consultation section, it said that if the LEA disagreed with the views of private school officials with respect to the use of a third-party provider, the LEA would provide in writing to such private school officials the reasons why the LEA disagrees. And that piece on third-party providers and the reason for disagreeing is actually true of all the ESSA programs that require equitable participation. But section 1117 of ESSA goes a little bit further for Title I-A only, and it says if the district disagrees with the views of the private school officials with respect to any of the consultation issues, the LEA should provide in writing the reasons why the LEA disagrees. And this is simply there to ensure that the conversation can continue, that it's not just no and we move on, but there's a better understanding of the reasons for the LEA's decision, and it will help the rest of the conversation in consultation to progress. Additionally, section 1117 notes that such consultation shall include meetings of the LEA and private school officials that occur before the LEA makes any design that affects the opportunities of eligible private school children to participate in Title I-A benefits. Well, that's like a lot of verbiage, as a lot of federal law is, to simply say the district is not going to be making decisions that affect the participation of private school students before you have a chance to talk with them in timely and meaningful consultation. It doesn't negate that the final decision is the LEA's. It's that the final decision is the LEA's following timely and meaningful consultation on all of these topics that affect the opportunities of private school students to equitably participate. The consultation meeting shall continue throughout implementation and assessment of services provided under Title I-A. So it's not a one-shot. We're going to keep touching base, keep working together, look at how the program is working, to see if it can be improved. Just keep talking throughout the year. Consultation shall include a discussion of service delivery mechanisms an LEA can use to provide equitable services. And that's pretty broad. It can mean service delivery mechanisms like using a third party. It can mean service delivery mechanisms like using technology or using notebooks in the classroom or using certain apps with the Title I-A students. So it's fairly broad, but that's the importance of consultation, is it really does go through all of these kinds of issues. Section 1117 goes on to say that funds allocated to the LEA for educational services and other benefits to eligible private school students must be obligated in the fiscal year for which the funds are received by the LEA. So I'll give a really quick explanation of that. So in July of 2019, the LEA can begin to use funds for the 2019 to 20 school year. There are some variations and ins and outs, but I think for today's discussion, that's what you need to know. Now, those funds need to be obligated in the whole fiscal year, which doesn't end until September 30th. So this is saying that, first of all, we have a little more than the school year to obligate them, but maybe even more importantly, it's that these funds were generated to serve the students here and now. And so through timely and meaningful consultation, we want to get a program designed, get it off the ground, and help it to be effective so that we're expending those funds on the students that they really were appropriated for. In addition to all of these, I'm going to jump to an obligation of the state. So the state education agency, the SEA, must provide a timely annual notice to appropriate private school officials of the allocation of funds for educational services that the LEA has determined are available for eligible private school students. So you'll recall back in consultation, the amount of funds and how those funds were determined was one of the consultation topics between the private school officials and the LEA officials. But in addition to that, the SEA, the state, provides an annual notice of the funds available to appropriate private school officials. So you, as a private school official, you would hear this from both the state, the SEA, and the public school district, the LEA. Now, I've said, numerous times that this is the LEA's program. They retain program control, fiscal control. They have the final decision. But there are a couple of safeguards for private school officials just to be sure that everybody is on the same page. It's kind of a summation document, and it's called the written affirmation. So the law requires that each LEA maintain in its records and provide to the SEA a written affirmation that is signed by private school officials, each participating private school, that meaningful consultation has occurred. This written affirmation also has the options for private school officials to indicate that they don't believe timely and meaningful consultation has occurred, or the end result is a program that's not equitable. And if private school officials don't provide the written affirmation in a reasonable period of time, the LEA still has to send something to the state, but it won't be sending the written affirmation. It will be sending documentation that consultation has occurred or been attempted. So the idea behind this is to give the state a kind of window to look into the consultation process throughout its LEAs and hopefully hear about an issue and help to ameliorate an issue before it becomes a bigger problem. And that brings me to my final set of slides for today's webinar. Under ESSA, there is a stated goal of reaching agreement, that the goal of consultation is to reach agreement. And while certainly it's really always been that way, right? We're in consultation, we're working together, it's now specifically stated in ESSA. And this requirement emphasizes that consultation should be collaborative and should be focused on best meeting the needs of the children being served. You can find the guidance on reaching agreement in the non-regulatory guidance that I talked about at the very introduction on resources. It's dated November 16th, 2016, and it's also in the draft Title I guidance that is dated March 11th, 2019. So if you wanted to see anything in more detail on reaching agreement, that's where you could find it. But I think we can answer the question, how does consultation lead to agreement, by looking at a specific question and answer in that earlier guidance. And it is question N13. And that question and answer in the guidance lists the key elements that are relevant to the equitable participation of private school students, educational personnel, and families. And as I go through these, what I'd like you to do is to think in terms of those elements of equitable participation that I presented at the very beginning, a kind of lens to look at these elements of consultation that lead to achieving the goal of reaching agreement. So, and these are taken, as I said, directly from N13 in the guidance. Consultation ensures ample time and a genuine opportunity for all participants to express their views and to have their views seriously considered. It provides an opportunity to discuss viable options for ensuring equitable participation. And so look at that viable options. And so you as a private school official, for example, may come into consultation and have an idea what you think the program would look like. Or you as a public school official may come in and think these are the services we'll be offering. You know, you may not be quite in sync. And there are many viable options often to meeting the needs of the students. And so this is an opportunity to discuss what those are. It assumes the public school district has not made any decisions that will impact equitable participation. And it assumes the public school district has not established a blanket rule that precludes private school students from receiving certain services authorized under the programs. So what a blanket rule means is, for example, as I said, in section 1117 of the law, it says the services for Title 1A can be direct services, counseling, mentoring, one-on-one tutoring. A blanket rule would be for the public school district, for the LEA, to come into consultation and say, we don't do counseling. That's a blanket rule, that they haven't considered the needs of the students, the viable options, your discussion, all of those sorts of things. So that's an example of a blanket rule. Because it's an allowable activity, it has to at least be on the table before it can be dismissed, and it has to be subject to timely and meaningful consultation. It includes a discussion of the consultation timeline, provides adequate notice of such consultation to ensure meaningful consultation. So that's one. It's, you know, you want to give public school officials need to give private school officials enough time not to get this on their calendar for sure, but not only that, the phrasing goes on to say, and the likelihood that those involved will be well prepared with the necessary information and data for decision making. It's a waste of everyone's time to call a meeting too soon and have private school officials come and say, well, I don't really have a good handle on the needs of the students because I didn't have the time to review the test scores, to look at report card grades, to talk with the teachers, to get input from parents. So everybody needs to be part of that consultation timeline and to have a notice of the exact time and date of the meeting with ample time for everyone to be ready. It begins well before the implementation of services. It establishes positive and productive working relationships, makes planning effective, and continues through the implementation of the equitable services. An overall summation of that is that the consultation serves to ensure that the services provided meet the needs of eligible students and teachers. And that's, in the end, the goal that we're all attempting to achieve when we enter into timely and meaningful consultation and work to reach agreement together. So I am going to give you a few little announcements about what is coming up, and that should give you time, if you have additional questions, to put them in the chat box, and we should have a minute or two to answer those questions. So definitely thank you for attending today. I appreciate your attendance throughout the webinar. Now, the CDE will have a recording of this webinar on their website, www.capspdnow.com. There are 2 additional webinars, October 10th on Titles 2 and 3, same time as you had today, and November 14th on Title 4. At that website above, you can register, and I would encourage you to join in and register soon. And then there are some in-person trainings. So I will be traveling to California and hope to see many of you in person. And that same website is your registration website. So September 11th, I'll be in Sacramento. September 17th in Montclair, and September 18th in San Diego. These sessions will run from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. with a lunch break, and it will have an in-depth hands-on presentations on consultation and all the ESSA titles requiring equitable participation, and will actually go more in depth than I can possibly do in a webinar series, as well as having hands-on presentation. And Katie reminds us CDE will be traveling with me as well. I definitely look forward to that. So we will be a team traveling throughout the state, presenting this information to you, taking your questions, and trying to get answers to all of this. And we do have, September 17th, Paul writes, only has one more spot open. Jump on it. The others are more open. I believe the venues are larger. So we have one more question, and then I'll say goodnight to you. As long as both parties agree on how the money is spent and it meets student needs, is it allowable, or are there further guidelines? So there are some guidelines on what are allowable activities under Title I. I tried to direct you to those as far as the direct services to students. They can be pull-out, summer, before and after school, a combination. They can be direct instruction, counseling, mentoring, one-on-one tutoring. They can be professional development, and they must be some parent and family engagement. There is more information in that guidance, and this is more of the in-depth information that I can present in person with more examples. So I hope that that summarizes it enough for you as we stand now, but know that there would be more on that on the in-person trainings. So once again, thank you so much. It was my pleasure to be here. Thank you again to all the staff at CDE for their support, for their sponsorship, for their assistance in pulling all of this together. I look forward to the remaining of the webinars, and definitely look forward to joining CDE in California during the month of September. Thank you so much. Good night.